Hello, today we're going to be looking at Lab 1. So Lab 1 is going to take you through the process of creating a form with a bunch of different elements on it. So we're sitting here looking at the instructions right now. It's a lab, so the thing that makes a lab different from an assignment, for me at least, is I'm going to make a solution like this where I walk you through the instructions, walk you through a sample solution, show you what it's supposed to look like. My expectations are that labs are good because we're talking about a possible solution right here. So there really shouldn't be anything missing. There shouldn't be things that aren't there. There shouldn't be anything wrong with it. I mean, there might be, but I expect it to be good. Whereas on an assignment, right, where there's not a solution, there's a little bit more leeway. So here I am looking at the instructions. So we're going to create a pretty elaborate form here. We'll talk about these things in a minute. This finished product is going to look something like that. It shouldn't look exactly like that because that's not really what this is about. As with everything, it's a chance to practice the content. This could be styled more, it could be styled less. Not that important. The important thing is that it's valid and that it meets the criteria. I can tell you from experience that people generally don't look at these PDFs that I give them full of criteria, which is, I don't entirely understand that, but I'm telling you, this is how I grade it. So if you can check all those little boxes, then I really don't have a good reason not to give you full credit. So let's talk about the points before we start. So passes HTML validation. So I will validate this lab for sure. So that means you should validate it as well. I have a video on validating that you should have seen this week already. So we're talking about validator.w3.org. So make sure to validate it, make sure it passes. If it doesn't pass, you're going to lose points there. A good starting point is just starting with that boilerplate, right? So just good, clean starting point. So you definitely have a form, right? So that's the big element. The smaller element is make sure that those fields or those properties are set. So make sure you've got an action and a method. Even though this form doesn't actually do anything, when you press the submit button, I still want those things there because pretty soon we're going to be actually processing forms, and those things are going to be important. So every form element needs a label. In reality, many forms don't have labels, but on this I'm saying you do need labels. We're going to spend equal time talking about instructions and solutions. I am making sure that you bind your labels to the elements. And also the little CSS. This is probably, in my opinion, the most difficult part on the assignment is the CSS for the labels. Just, I'm not a big fan of CSS. It's hard. So I'm telling you exactly what to do, kind of. So text boxes, at least one. Make sure you set an ID and a name, right? So I'm asking for IDs and names on all your fields. One password field. One text area, which is slightly different. A checkbox, at least two option selects. We'll talk about what this looks like in a second. A set of radio buttons with at least two options and a submit button. And for your style sheet, I'm saying embedded. I'll show you what I mean by that and why I like it in a minute here. Basically, if you can cross off all those things from your form and they meet those criteria, then you should be good, right? I don't care that it looks pretty, just so long as it's usable. That's always the standard in this class, is usability. We're going to be kind of knee-deep in writing PHP and MySQL, and we don't really have the time to make really pretty-looking forms, so that's not what this class is about. But just make sure that your form is usable. All right, so looking at the finished example, right, these look like text fields. That's a password field. That's option select right there. There's multiple options in there. This is a set of radio buttons. Here's some checkboxes. It's going to look something like that. I don't care how you arrange it. I really don't. Just make sure you meet those criteria. Now let's have a look at my sample code, and I'll kind of walk you through that. At some point in the course, when I get used to my right hand, I will maybe write some code. But for now, you're just going to be watching me kind of navigate through pre-done examples. It makes things go faster, but it also might be a little too fast. I know I've seen a bunch of videos where people kind of use pre-done code, and it's oftentimes hard to follow because it goes so fast. There's just not much I can do about it. All right, so this stuff up in here, this is just boilerplate stuff. I don't need to talk about that because I talked about that in the boilerplate video. That's just kind of what I need to make this valid. Head tag closes right there. So you notice I got a big old style tag right? That's what you call an embedded style sheet. There are 3 ways to style a document, and I know some of you aren't so savvy with HTML and CSS, so let's talk about that. So this is CSS. CSS is how you address the presentation of elements on a web page. There are 3 ways to do it. One is inline. Inline is what you see when people are putting the style down in the tags themselves. That is a bad way of doing it. If you ever find yourself doing that, you should stop and figure out a different way to do it. That's pretty much, I think I can safely say that's a bad way of doing things. Another way is with an external style sheet. That's when you have a link tag and you're pointing to an external file. That's a good way of doing things. That's a great way of doing things when you've got a website and every page in that website is using the same rules, if you will. But when you've just got a single page that you're styling, this is a fine way of doing things. This is called an embedded style sheet. So it's got everything up here in the head tag between these style tags. So notice there's not an external style sheet here. I'm a big fan of this because it means you only have to turn in one file to me. So if you're using a link tag and you're linking to a style sheet, I'm going to ding you a point on that. Not because it's the wrong thing to do, generally speaking, but because it's not what I asked you to do. Trust me, it's easy to have your CSS and your HTML on the same page. It's just easy to work with. It's easy for me to demonstrate. And if you're not going to reuse the CSS, then there's really no reason to link to it. We'll come back to the style sheet in a minute here. I do want to point out some things, like I styled the body. I created this content container tag. You don't need to do that, right? That's not in the criteria. I just did that to give you something a little less horrific to look at. Because when I'm giving, I don't care if your page looks pretty bad, just so long as it's functional. I just wanted to give you something that actually looked like a web page. What you give me might not look that much like a web page, and I'm okay with that. So you don't have to care about this at all. You don't have to care about that at all. I'm not even really asking you to style the form, right? This is where my form gets a width and a height and a background color. You should do your own styling. If you're just copying what I'm doing, you're kind of doing this wrong. The only mandatory part of the CSS is that right there. That's my styling for the labels. You should mess around with it. Just do what you want to do. I kind of talk about this in the specifications. You do need to do display inline block. That's the right call for how you want to display labels. And width, I don't care how wide you want to make them. It kind of depends on what you're going for. That part's irrelevant. This is just style. These are just rules I created for the width of my inputs, which is not something you need to do. Right, a lot of talking. So the only thing that I'm actually asking you to do is that. And you know that because you looked at the specifications. That's why I'm sitting here talking for like dang near 10 minutes right now, because I'm not going to get a chance to meet some of you in class, so you need to know how I'm going to score things and what my expectations are. And my expectations are that you have a look at those specs and that you meet those specs. Anything above that is not going to get you extra credit. I mean, if you just want to make something that looks decent because you want to build up a portfolio or get some good experience, I say that's a great idea, but we have to come to an agreement on how I'm going to score these things. Alright, so that's the end of my head. I head down to the body, right? So for a boilerplate, the only requirements for a body is that you have an opening and a closing tag. This right here, this big old container div, notice it runs from there to there. That is completely optional. That, just if you're wondering, that is how you notice that there's this white part of the page which is centered on the page. That's because it's in that container div. Not required, but it is something I did just to increase the presentation a little bit. If you're new or bad at HTML and CSS, that's where that comes into play. I've got a H1, a H2. Those are not part of the specs, but I put them on there for presentation. Here's the actual form, right? Notice there's my action, there's my method. So I got those two attributes set. I just put pound signs in there. Those don't go anywhere. Action is the name of the script that will process this form, but we're not processing it, so that's nothing for now. Method, you've got two options. You got get and you got post. Pretty soon, I think week 3 or so is when we'll learn the difference between get and post. Doesn't really matter. Just pick one. I'm doing a get. Seriously, it doesn't matter. And one of my best pieces of advice on this is when you're doing get or post for your method, do all caps. There's a good reason for it, and you'll learn it later, but for now, it's not imperative that it's either uppercase or lowercase, but I'm saying uppercase is a good idea. Alright, so the first thing I've got is this text input, right? This is where they're putting in their name. All right, notice I don't have an ID on it. I just did a name. I'm asking you to do a name and an ID. In fact, I guess what kind of an instructor would I be if I didn't model what I was telling you you needed to do? So I will create an ID, and you'll get to see my marvelous typing skills. You is so hard to type. All right, there we go. And if I want to bind this label to that, I say for. All right, so that's where names and IDs come in. Now let me just have a word about this. So in the long run, we're not actually going to use a lot of IDs in PHP. We use names, and that's going to be a little bit of a transition for a lot of you, because in something like JavaScript, you use a lot of IDs. In PHP, you use a lot of names. And in fact, I don't use IDs at all, more often than not. You can kind of see that in my code. Some places I have IDs, sometimes I don't have IDs. But the reason I need an ID right here is if you're going to bound or bind a label to an element, then you have to bind it by that ID. So those things need to match. That is kind of the rule. If you have a label but you don't have a for attribute, then it's not going to be bound to anything. So I have added the ID here and the for there, which means it's bound. That doesn't do a whole lot for us in a text box. It's actually way more important for something like a radio button or a checkbox, but I'll show you that in a minute. So I should do the same thing for password, just because I said I should do that. Now, one of the things that you might be wondering about right now, let me try and do something interesting here. So you might be noticing that it probably seems kind of weird to have a name and an ID with the same value. Well, if you need an ID and you need a name, then I don't know why they wouldn't have the same value. But on the other hand, it is kind of confusing. So I'm just trying to show you how this works a little bit. So if I want to bind this label to this password field, notice it's based on the ID. It's not based on the name. So the bind is based on the ID. Not that it's terribly important here. All right, and so as per the instructions, this label needs to be bound as well. So I will say for. So I guess I am typing a little bit today. I didn't really intend to do that, but there's no harm in typing about this much. And if I want to properly bind that, I would do that. I also know perfectly well that there's really no reason to bind these labels up here because they're not going to do anything for me, but technically that's why I wrote it out, and it's not a bad idea to do that, so I did it. So anyways, let's look at this option select, because this is actually interesting. I probably spent way too much time talking about labels and binding and IDs, but it's also probably something that's new to you, so I don't mind talking about it for a minute. All right, so this is what an option select structure looks like. So the select is the name of the group altogether, and then inside of it you've got these options. And so options have values, and they have that. That is what's going to get passed behind the scenes. That is what's going to show up on the screen. So like this is hidden data, if you will, that's going to be submitted with the form. That is what is going to be displayed on the actual form. So it's time to have a look at this. So let me show you how this goes. Save that. If you didn't know how Notepad++ works, you can go run, launch in whatever you want to launch it in. And I'll show you how things work. Do you notice how I click on username and my cursor's inside the field? And if I click on password, my cursor's in the field? That's what binding does. So you know when I did that for, that's the value of it. And that's why I said it doesn't help a whole lot, because normally if you want to type in a text field, you just type in the text field, right? I mean, fine. But you can see it's kind of nice. It's kind of a nice feature to be able to click on the label and click in the text field, and that's what for does. And like I said, it's not terribly important here. Anyways, this is an option select. So notice the two options in there. That's what those are. It's you might want to call that a drop down, but in HTML language, it's called an option select. You pick one. Now the next step on our tour. You can have more than one thing there if you want to. So I want to point out I'm using a field set here. A field set doesn't do a whole lot. It just kind of puts a border around a box. I'll show you. Sorry, trying to find my example. Clumsy left-handed mouse stuff here. notice this box around those options right there. That's a field set. It doesn't do anything, but that's what that is. So choose your color, right? That's just a prompt. So when we're looking at these, we've got labels, right? The labels are pretty straightforward. They are what they are. Notice that they're bound to things based on IDs. The inputs themselves, they are of type radio. And notice that they all have the same name. The name is what assigns them a group, if that makes sense. So you could have multiple sets of radio buttons on a form, but you're only allowed to select one at a time, and that's how you kind of link them together. The field set doesn't exactly link them together. It's the name that links them together. And these values are the actual contents of the buttons themselves that's going to get passed. The IDs aren't doing a whole lot for us here. Literally, the ID only serves the purpose of being bound to the label. Now let me show you how the binding works here. The binding actually is helpful in this example. So when you're clicking these radio buttons, you're supposed to click the little circle, but the circle is pretty small and picky. It's pretty cool that you can actually click the label here, right? You actually get some mileage out of it. So I think it's pretty much mandatory to bind your labels to the radio buttons in this situation. Up here it's not as critical, but down here I think it's actually important. So notice that when I click one, I can't click the other ones, right? It deselects them. That's a perfect example of a radio button. Only a couple things left on this form, so let's go have a look at those. So next is remember me. That's a label. It's not bound, so I should fix that, and I will fix that. I'm just not going to make you watch me type it. So checkbox, right? It's just simply giving it a checkbox. It's got a type. It's got a name. We'll talk about required in a second here. I didn't make you do required, but required, when you put that attribute in there, that is telling the form that you have to check that checkbox in order for the form to submit. You could also check that kind of thing with JavaScript, but I just wanted to show you that. You've seen stuff like this before. There's forms all over the web where it's like, I've read these instructions, I am a certain age, or whatever, some kind of consent thing. You see these all the time. So I have two checkboxes. Let me show you the difference between a checkbox and a radio button, because they are different. All right, so radio buttons, you can only have one selected. With checkboxes, you can have multiple selected. I'll show you what happens here. If I try and submit this form without checking I abide, I get yelled at. So that's where the required piece comes in. So now you know the difference between checkboxes and radio buttons. And this right here is a text area. Text areas are a lot like just a normal text box, but you can put a whole bunch of content in there. And they get scroll bars, and you can specify their properties. Let's have a quick look at that. So notice I've got a submit button. Nothing terribly interesting here. And there's my text area. Notice the text area of all our of all of our form fields, text area is the only one that's a container tag. In other words, there's an opening and there's a closing. For this one, I probably, I don't know how much sense it makes to have a label bound to it, but I'm going to go through and I'm going to do that. So I'm going to pause this, and in like a couple seconds here, my form will have all the IDs and labels bound, so you can understand that a little bit better. So as you can see, I went in for all my labels and I put 4s on them, and that means I also had to create corresponding IDs. Not a huge difference to my form. I'm going to save that. I'm going to go back. I'm going to visit that web page, and let's have a look at the finished product here. So the only difference is now I can click on the labels, and that acts as checking the boxes. That's actually a useful feature. And I don't know why you'd really want to click on the comments thing and put you in the comments box, but now you can. Right, so I hope you can kind of see that it's pretty important that you bind your labels for these kind of select structures. It's not so important when you're talking about a text-based thing. So that's the solution. Whole lot of talking, but this being an online course, this is really kind of takes the place of what we would probably spend an in-class period doing. So I don't feel too bad about talking your ear off about it. I just want to make sure that you understand what's going on as best you can. I want to reiterate that when you do your lab, you shouldn't be trying to recreate this. If you just recreate my form, well, you're kind of cheating yourself out of the practice. But that being said, if you're really struggling with something, don't hesitate to really try and borrow pretty heavily from what I've done. because that's why I do this, right? It's in the event that you get stuck, in the event that you're not sure what to make out of those instructions or how to implement something, then yeah, sure, go ahead and rely heavily on this. But the only way you're going to get good at it is by doing your own work. So add some things, subtract some things, change some things. This is the main idea for how this should turn out. The only meaningful CSS here is this right here. Or sorry, well, it's all meaningful, I guess, a bit, but that's the only part required. Inline block for your labels just means basically don't worry about that so much. This just means that you can basically, this is the property you need to give them to make sure that they can have a width and also have something on the same line. This is just defining how wide they are. This is just saying that the text on them is going to be aligned to the right. The rest of this is just CSS. I can't recap CSS in anything less than like a 10-week class. So, you know, if you like some things from this, go ahead and give them a try. Otherwise, not. I guess I'm sitting here. This video's over 20 minutes. I'm sure some of you are real new to CSS, so let me talk about what we've got going on here. That's a hex value. That's that light blue color. This is just the background color of my page, which is the body. That content tag or div. So if you know this stuff, then you don't need to keep watching anymore. But if you're not so great with HTML, CSS, go ahead and watch this. See that big div tag, which is my whole body? So I give it a width of 80%, and this right here is how you center a div. It's not intuitive, but that's how you center it. And so basically what this is saying is, well, this div is going to be 80% of the width of my screen. This is saying, hey, that 80% of the width, center it. So in other words, like 10% of the space of the screen is on the right, 10% is on the left. Padding, that's how much space is inside the div. And background color FFF, that means it's white. Let me point out those things just to show you what they look like. Right, so notice this is about 80% the width of my screen. That's about 10% of the width of my screen. That's about 10% of the width of my screen. Notice it's centered. That padding, notice this little gap inside. It's like from there to there. That's 25 pixels. I think that was all I had in there for that. Yep. And so this is my styling the form itself. So I gave my form a width, I gave it a height, I gave it a color, I defined that space between the edge and the actual contents. This right here rounds the corners, and that just says all my text is aligned to the right. This right here, this is the scariest looking part of the form. Styling inputs is ugly. Oftentimes people will create IDs or classes for them, but this is one way you can do it. So this is saying, hey, my text field and my password field, I want them to be 100 pixels wide, because otherwise they end up being sorry, let me show you what it looks like. That's just setting the width of those, because otherwise they'll be a little bit wider. So that is a solution to the lab. So I hope that helped clear up some things for you, or perhaps it was all review, and that's not a bad thing either. There will come a time when everyone's learning new content. That's not necessarily the case right now, but we will get there. So I hope this helped. Thanks for watching.